And we're live with episode 21 of the Wake Up podcast. And this is going to be the first episode of the Bitcoin Time series. So people who know me and who've listened to me in the past or read some of my stuff know that in I think it was early 2019, I created the first edition of the Bitcoin Times. And it started off as this talk that I was going to give, and then it turned into this big write-up, and then I thought I'd turn it into a PDF. And then at the end of the year, I brought a bunch of brilliant writers together in the last edition to do Bitcoin Time Series 2 or Edition 2. And then this year, I've brought together another series of incredible minds to do Bitcoin Times Edition 3, or the 2020 edition, which I think this year will go down in history as a special year in the most retarded of ways. And I guess this first episode, I've got one of the contributors, Parker Lewis from Unchained Capital, on the call with me. And what we're going to do is we're going to dive into the nuances and the spirit and the essence and the ideas and the inspiration behind the article that he wrote, which is Bitcoin is the great DeFinancialization. So Parker, thank you for coming on. I'll let you do a bit of an intro here, man, and let the guys know a little bit about yourself and, sort of what motivated this article.
Yeah, well, first, Alex, one, thanks for organizing. I think, I hadn't participated before, but two, kind of honored to have been asked. And then I think we initially had a conversation. It was either late September or early October. And I think at that time I had promised that I'd have something in like 4 to 6 weeks. And then I don't know if I was the single thing holding it up, but I definitely, it took me a little bit more to articulate my thoughts around this subject. It's something I've thought a lot about. But then as luck would have it, or, as the world works, it just so happens that might have taken a little bit extra time to get out, but then we were able to drop it on the day that ultimately we got over 20K, and that timing was perfect. So I felt bad that I was delaying things, but worked out well. So glad to be contributed, honored to be contributed, and also glad to be here to be talking about it in more detail and to be talking about Bitcoin Times, but then also Bitcoin more generally as well.
Absolutely, man. Do you know what? Actually, I'll pull a thread to kick us off here. The whole process of writing, and I'm actually curious about your process, because you weren't the only one holding it back. Like, I mean, do you know what's funny? When you're playing, like, I mean, I'm a play editor because I know nothing about publications except for putting, something together like this. But when you're in my position, contributing, but also waiting for other people to put their stuff together, I actually found myself, putting off finishing my own piece. And it was kind of like your delays. Like, who else was sort of behind on theirs? I can't remember if there was anyone else behind on theirs, but I think what that ended up making me do was also delay mine. So it was, but it was an interesting thing, because I didn't really know what I was going to write about initially. Like, and I have this thing when, I get this seed of an idea or a thread of a concept, and then I start kind of pulling on it. And, as time goes on, like, the quality of the content or the quality of what I write, or the, the idea starts to flesh out. And, I intended my original article to be somewhere like, 2,000 words, 2,500 words. It ended up 6,500, which is like yours. So what's your process of writing? Because
mine is very, very similar, where I'll have these ideas where either I'm walking around the lake and there'll be an idea, like I'll see something that overused term, but something will trigger me, where I'll see somebody make a comment where, like, you know what, that's just wrong. And I need to formulate the thoughts to be able to put it on paper. And so I'll, oftentimes before I even start writing, I'll see something come up and be like, nope, somebody said something and like they don't understand this and they're thinking about this the wrong way, and I need to write about it. And I won't start writing, but it'll be like, okay, is that big enough to be an article, or is that big enough to be a tweet? Either like I'm just going to dunk on somebody on a tweet, or I'm going to write. And then, so that's like the first filter. And then when I get to actually, kind of the thing that often triggers it, which is I think I did a podcast with Daniel Prince. I think this would have been it was either just before we talked or just after we talked in late September, early October. And I talked about, he brought up DeFi or something, question about DeFi.
Yep.
And I was like, no, the real thing is it's not decentralized finance. It's that Bitcoin's going to definancialize the economy. And I kind of talked about that idea. I was like, you know what? I think I said it on that. I was like, I'm going to write an article about this. And that was kind of the, you know what? I'm fired up about this. These people, who are talking about decentralized finance are idiots. It's actually about how to definancialize the economy that we should really be focused on. And whether we're focused on it or not, it's an inevitable consequence of Bitcoin. And so then it was like, okay, that was then the thing that happened and said, okay, this is the next thing that you're going to write. Because the other thing that when I started writing this Gradually and Suddenly series, the summer of last year, summer of 2019, and but early on there was just a ton of things that I had been thinking about, in the years leading up that I felt like my voice or my background would lend well to. Writing doesn't come easy to me. Like as you've now seen, kind of the initial product versus iterating on it and making it actually like not just drivel is a process, and so it's not something that comes natural to me. But that early on there was just a lot of things that I had thought about for a long time, so that the amount of things that I had to write on the subjects were very easy. But I take this approach where kind of when I started writing, it was kind of weekly, and then it was once a month, and now it's kind of gotten to a point where it's once every 3 months, because I don't want to write just to write. I want to, and I don't want to be redundant. I want to write things that I feel like need to be said, but that I also have some, not necessarily unique, but just that there's something valuable to, and some ideas that I have, and I can present them in ways that are valuable and valuable to a broader discussion, or help some other audience kind of think about Bitcoin in the right context, or I hate to use right, but in a context of how I think about it, that it may then be leverageable by them, or may connect with somebody, because I think that there's a reality with Bitcoin that there's no one size fit all. Somebody different could write about the same subject, and they could key on ideas that connect with people, and that inevitably, with the universe of people out there that are interested in Bitcoin, and that number being growing, that you put something out there, if it's on a subject that matters, that, and you have kind of a background or voice that can lend well to it, that someone might read it and be like, no, that's drivel. Somebody else might read it and say, that is the article on Bitcoin that helped me understand what's actually happening here. And so I kind of use that as a guidepost. And then with this article specifically, or more tangibly, I have an idea and a framework, but it's getting kind of an initial data dump out of my head onto paper. And that first thing, usually, when I read it, it makes me want to throw up. I'm like, that is not logical. That's not logical thought, or that's not a logical progression of an argument. And then I try to really kind of make sure that every kind of flow of my article, like that everything is purposeful in it. That's like I'm leading up to a culmination, and each one of these parts flows together with each other, but that are also kind of critical to that end point, to helping somebody understand the perspective.
Dude, you touched on an interesting thing there. It reminds me of while I was in Germany, I was on like a Tinder rampage, and sort of somewhere in the summer, there was this girl that I was dating at some point, and she was going to uni, and she had, just like most people who are generally good-natured, they think, they've got this sort of social justice warrior bent to them. Now she was interesting. She was more intelligent than the normal sort of, Tinder person, I dated in the past. And she kind of was, opposed to certain things like, feminism and stuff like that, like in the right way. So she had been able to sort of pierce the veil on that stuff. But anyway, she was doing a degree on, what was it? The social media science. And I just laughed. I was like, what the fuck? kind of science is this pseudo-scientific crap? But anyway, part of that, for some reason, she had an elective to choose for renewable energy. And I was like, how does that even combine? But anyway, whatever. So she chosen this thing about renewable energy and studying mini grids in Africa, and what the regulations and stuff are. And she asked me if I could help because she knew I had a background in solar renewable energies and stuff like that. And she had to write this paper on it. And I started reading the paper, and I'm like, what the fuck is this drivel? Like, there was nothing, there was no argument there. It was just basically research slapped together and just opinions and conjecture from. Did I might get you to? Could you mute your side, because I can hear a lot of people in the background talking. So it was just this stuff that was just slapped together from what she'd heard or what she'd read on this website and this regulator. And I was like, so what's your argument? And she's like, well, I don't really have an argument. The teacher just asked me to write about this. And I'm like, yeah, but what is your argument on this? Like, does it make sense? Should this stuff be regular? And I actually got her onto reading Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, and I pulled out a bunch of notes and anecdotes, and I helped her structure it into something that became an argument, which is, all right, we're starting here. This is the assumption, this is the hypothesis, and we're sort of going to turn this whole piece into a fucking argument. And I said, the argument that I think makes sense here is that the only way for electricity generation and these mini grids and all this sort of stuff to work is for government and regulators to get the fuck out of the way. And I said, I don't see any of this stuff in any of this research or any of these other papers that you're quoting and referencing. Like, it's all fucking garbage. And you said earlier that you're not much of a writer, but I would argue that you are a brilliant writer in the sea of garbage that's available in the world, which is all of these uni students, they've forgotten what an argument is. It's just that all they're doing is just slapping shit on top of shit on top of shit. And there's no one who can make a cohesive, accurate, argument towards something. And I feel like, Bitcoiners in particular, or, libertarians, of, people with sort of, I guess, our bent in some way, shape or form, seem to be, maybe it's the trait of disagreeableness. Like I was writing about that earlier today. It's like we seem to communicate in a way, that has an argument, and that manifests itself in Twitter as like, toxic behavior. But in our longer form pieces, it actually adds value to someone because someone can read through an argument. So anyway, just it was an interesting anecdote from my end of just seeing how most writing today doesn't have an argument, doesn't have a point. It's just words on a fucking page. And I think what I've found, and I think one of the things that really has kept me, call it, engaged in the Bitcoin space is writing and thoughts and thinking and podcasts from people like yourself, that has an argument or a point. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that, I think we're one of the healthy parts of when I say, it's writing doesn't come natural to me, it's that, and maybe this is kind of, I think probably underneath the cover is probably how, all good process, not all good processes, but many good processes work, that, that if you're your own best critic, because I think, and this is, it's one of the things that I think is valuable about your writings, everyone that's contributing, everyone that is willing to put crazy thoughts out there into the world, which again, I don't think they're crazy. I don't think any of us are crazy, but if you're going to do that, that you better be your biggest critic, because it's to say like, like steel manning your own argument, because if you're going to go out there and you're going to, put something on the internet that says, hey, I think that this thing Bitcoin is really important for these reasons, you better have checked all of your arguments and been super hypercritical of yourself before that goes out into the world, right? And that, oftentimes I'll get the question of, hey, can you point me to somebody that is very thoughtful that doesn't like Bitcoin? And that realistically, I feel like most people that once they go down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, they're like, we're very incentivized to question our assumptions and to be like, hey, are we crazy? Like, am I crazy right now? Am I wrong? Am I wrong? Did something happen that needs to cause me to change? Because if I happen to be wrong about this whole thing, I'm going to look like an idiot, you know?
Not only look like an idiot, but I'm going to be financially wrecked for the rest of my life, because most of us, I
Yeah,
think, are so balls deep in Bitcoin, it's not even
yeah,
funny.
right. Like, but at this, yeah, and the consequence of that is it's like, well, put my money. One of the guys who's it's one of my best friends in the world, but he's also works here at Unchained. Well, he said, I put my mouth where my money was. So he'd already, kind of owned Bitcoin, and then I came and joined Unchained, and I convinced him to leave his fiat job to join Unchained. They're like, our interests are always aligned. It's like it's the concept of the Texas hedge. I own Bitcoin because I believe in it. I work at Unchained because I believe in what we're building here, and then I write about Bitcoin. So all three of those things, it's like my everything is massively aligned.
Yep.
If I lose big,
Yep.
like, and but at the same time, I'm doing what I believe in, and that is an asset that comes into my writing, but also the writing process, because it's, again, it's not that I don't want to be wrong. It's that this is a complicated subject, and the ideas that are flowing around in my head, it's like I know that there's something there, but if I'm going to be able to communicate that, because that also is part of the filter, that's part of what inspired me to, or not, I hate the word inspire, but it's one of the things that led me to write was I've got all these ideas in my head, and one of the I became friends, and one of the ways that I got into Bitcoin was by meeting Safety and a Moose, and I just had this very visceral or tangible recognition of what his book, I'd already started to, in small ways become interested in Bitcoin, started buying Bitcoin before he sent me an early manuscript. But it was that helped crystallize my thought. But then also it was, safe if he was going to go explain the same idea to somebody 1,000 times or 10,000 times, it was much more leverageable if you put it in writing, that people could read a book. And that's how I kind of think about in two ways, my writing is, you know, it's valuable as a kind of acquisition tool or helping people understand Bitcoin, what we do at Unchained. But that if I just think about my own time as an individual, I can sit down and I probably spent, I would say, 50 hours writing that piece, that we put out. And but then I think about all the time that, my articles of, kind of are read. I think my most popular article has been read for thousands of hours, where it's like, okay,
Yep.
I could either have that, one-to-one conversation, and I'm not going to be able to be as effective in having that conversation if I haven't distilled my thoughts down. And so that writing process, then whenever when we have this conversation now, if I'm sitting down with a large potential investor, either in Unchained or somebody that's thinking about buying Bitcoin, if I want to have this exact conversation about why Bitcoin is going to definancialize the economy, I've now written on the subject, and I've already had the process which you've seen now, like the first iteration, which is the drivel, that I've kind of refined, edited, taken out things that didn't make sense, make sure that the arguments are concise, or that everything that is in there is core to the ultimate culmination of the article, so that then when I'm having these conversations, I have that mental framework to rely upon, that it wasn't just the first iteration of the thought, it was the more developed thing. And part of my process too is I want to go through that like what I shared with you guys was I had already done like 4 rounds of getting it, into that form, which still wasn't a great form, but it's like, okay, what is the minimum tolerable level that I'm willing to share this with one of my peers? Because then that predates they're looking at it, kind of telling me what doesn't make sense, and being able to iterate and refine, that then ultimately turns into something that I'm willing to share with people I don't know.
Yeah, I think the point that I'm hearing here is that it's about, it's a journey of clarification, and that for me is also why I write. Like, I love the process of coming up with one of these brain fart ideas, and probably similar to you, I've got all these lists on my iPhone, lists for tweets, lists for articles, I've got a series of books that I want to write, so I've got lists and notes for that shit. And every time, like, whether I'm running, I get so many ideas at the gym, and this is why I miss the gym a lot. But like, gym helps me shower, taking a shit, like all this sort of stuff, like really, really helps me. And yeah, like for me, writing, and I think what I'm hearing you say has become this process of clarification of an idea or a thread or a thought or a concept, and you sort of clarifying it for yourself. But like you said, you spend the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours clarifying it for yourself, and it's laser fucking sharp, and it's an argument, it's got a point, and then you can magnify that, and other people can come on that journey with you, because when they start, by the time they get to the end of it, they've sort of learnt something new, they've uncovered, they've illuminated an area of darkness. And I think, yeah, man, it's just such a writing, I think everyone should do it, and it's just such a interesting thing, but they need to do it with with like a point in mind. And
Yeah, I think that's hugely critical. Where, and I mean, it makes sense if somebody's a student, right, and they haven't worked or kind of have that attention to detail. It's like when I write, it's also to the point of I don't get on a schedule where I'm going to write once a week, or I'm going to write when I have something to say, and I'm also not going to put it out until I'm satisfied with it. That they're, and you can do that in a work environment where obviously at Unchained, I've got obligations to, the company, to my teammates, and there's a certain role I play. But I also know that, hey, I'm not doing this just for, to get eyeballs into Unchained's website. I'm putting it out because it's valuable, and it's valuable. It'll be valuable to a lot of people. And a student that's sitting there is probably, I think, I'm not an expert on it, so I'm not going to rant about it. But when you think about the construction of how our education system works, it's like if you tell somebody you have to write 1,000 words, and you have to give it to me by Wednesday at 5 p.m. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to write 500 words or whatever the requirement is, and it's going to be ready on Wednesday. And then it's less about actually saying something, and it's more about meeting the requirement. But it's also, for somebody that doesn't have real world experience, or a lot of it, that doesn't have kind of that properly aligned incentive, all it turns out to be is 500 loosely constructed words that where you sit down and read and you're like, okay, wait, what did you say? And that's kind of in a sense, it's only make sure that what you're saying actually says something.
Dude, I cannot tell you how funny this is that you just said that, because when I asked her why she was writing this, she said the exact fucking thing that you just said. She was like, well, the professor told me it was due on this date and that it has to be 10,000 words. And I was like, but you're not saying anything. And she's like, yeah, well, but they're not interested in that. I was like, wow. Like, because I haven't been to uni for what, like 12 years. So like I've forgotten what academia was all about, but it just reminded me of how deranged, like, I mean, I call this fiat education. Like it's literally the wrong set of incentives, and this is why you make you incentivize with garbage, and you're gonna get garbage out the other fucking end. So it's
it's a structural problem.
Man. It is. And speaking of structural problem, I think there's a perfect segue for our piece, which is, I think, the structural problem that has been created through, so very much in the same way as the fiat academia creates structural problems of just the production of nonsensical ideas and the proliferation of nonsensical ideas. We have this structural problem from an economic, monetary standpoint that proliferates what I think of as deranged financialization, like complete madness that the financialized world sort of has become known as. So anyway, I don't know if I should give an opening question here, or if how about I let you open up sort of the theme behind this, and then I'll hit you with an opening question.
Yeah, so I think that one, I've touched on kind of what the inspiration was, which was having a conversation with Daniel Prince, and this idea is kind of linked to this idea of so many people being drawn up in decentralized finance and wanting to almost like have this culture of like we can code these machines and we're going to get even more financialization. Like that's great, and that really that I see Bitcoin being largely an unwinding of that financialization. And part of kind of getting into the article was defining what do you mean by financialization, and deciphering between the fact that when I say that Bitcoin is the great definancialization, that it's the driver that's going to cause the unwinding of the last 3-4 decades of financialization, but that is different from investing, and that there will continue to be stocks and bonds and financial intermediation, and all that's fine. It's just that everything's going to be right sized once the proper incentives and money get fixed. And so kind of having that as like an overarching theme, that like we're not going to go from a world that's hyper financialized where and really kind of for the benefit of, I think the best place to go in to help people kind of level set of where I come at this from is I think that it's categorically insane. And I think the more that people wake up from a trance and actually think about it, and this isn't everybody, but it's a lot of people in the developed world, or if not the vast majority, that they go to their day job and they work 60 hours a week, and then whatever little amount they're able to scrape by, they immediately plow into a 401k because there's some tax incentive to that. And the consequence of that is that what they do manage to save, they immediately put back at risk, and 2, they do it by investing in somebody else's company or funding somebody else's business, and saying like, does that, like, let me just stop for a second and think about whether or not that makes sense. And that type of risk taking is fundamentally different than somebody looking at a problem in the world and saying, I'm going to go solve that problem and I need some amount of capital to go do it, and I don't have it, and I'm going to go ask some other people for it. So it kind of creates this dichotomy of this differentiation between investing and risk taking, and saving in a monetary asset and not taking risk, and recognizing that we as a consequence of our central banks and the environment in which they've created, which is effectively money being engineered to lose its value, to do the thing that is opposite of what money is supposed to do, which is store value, understanding that the consequences of that are through that in kind of cycle of working, taking risk, being compensated, and then immediately being forced into a situation where you have to perpetually take risk, that on an individual level, that is insane. And that when you aggregate the consequence of all of those individual levels, you get a world where I think that the best way to kind of articulate it for somebody is, imagine a person has to replicate 20% or 40% of their savings over the course of a decade or 2 decades just to remain in the same place. Like, not only is that psychologically damning, but when you put everybody on that hamster wheel all at once, you get a massive amount of malinvestment, and the consequence is a lack of savings and inherent instability. So that really kind of was the driving force behind the article, was kind of setting that framework and then working through how and why Bitcoin stands to reverse that, and how monetary economics really help drive that, what I would say, risk taking for catching up or keeping up with inflation's sake, versus really intentional risk taking, and recognizing that that's an inherently gray situation in terms of, well, what risk taking falls in category A versus B. And in the article, I basically say that is inherently gray, but you know it when you see it, and that if you just fix the money, that that whole process will get sorted out because people will be evaluating, do I take risk or do I not? And when you have a form of money that actually has the properly aligned incentives that reward savings, that it's not that you don't get investment, that you don't get risk, or that you won't have pooled investment vehicles. It's just that there will be a more fine line and all the noise will be weeded out, and we'll actually be in a world where there's a lot more stability.
There's so many threads I want to pull on there. That was a really good overview. So let's maybe start with, let's talk about how you open the article, which is this. I mean, you and I know it's a fallacy, but it's sort of become, I don't want to call it common sense, but it's sort of become conventional wisdom, I think you called it, is this idea that you should make your money grow. So let's dig into that a little bit. Why does that exist? Why is it a dumb idea?
Yeah, I think it's more so a Madison Avenue con job, a sales job, than it is something that is inherent to the proper functioning of an economy, or to a fundamental or necessary function within an economy. But it's been this idea that, in combination, because financial firms had an incentive to sell products, that this idea that if you imagine yourself in university or you go to college and you come out and you get a job. I went through this exact process. I worked at Deutsche Bank, and then you get an amount of money, and before you even get it, they say, hey, if you throw it into this list of mutual funds, it's tax deferred, and you're presented with 10 options that are mutual funds that you have no idea what they hold, and you just say, yep, I'm going to max out my 401k, and then I'm going to put them into these things. I don't know what they are, but everyone's doing it. And it's kind of, everyone's living in this zombification world where they don't ask questions. Everybody else is doing, this is just what you do. You work. And this idea that like, you know the statement without probably even seeing it in print anywhere. It's like, you got to make your money grow. Your parents probably told you, your financial advisor probably told you. You never question the wisdom because everybody else that's working alongside of you on that hamster wheel or in that rat race never stopped to take a step back and be like, hey, does this make sense? Like, what am I actually doing when I'm taking my savings and putting it in this mutual fund? What is this mutual fund? Oh, it's labeled growth or credit, or like, people just don't know, and it's just they live on this autopilot loop, and that is marketing, right? Like, they create the mutual funds knowing that the people that are investing in them don't have any clue. They're just like, oh, it's growth, or it's mid-market, it's conservative, whatever it may be, but that this looping cycle is ultimately imprecise risk taking, but it is, the way I frame it in the article is, because everybody's conditioned to make your money grow, that whole idea has only really kind of become into the mainstream consciousness because there's a need to replicate your wealth. And that need is, if everybody in society-wide is conditioned that my money loses its value by 2% a year, that very fact creates the necessity to replicate value already created in the world. And how are you going to do that? And I think I've got this kind of just simple, 3-step process, which is money loses its value, need to replace money that's lost its value, need financial products to help me do that. Because inherently you have to take risk in order to go make money. You have to put money at risk to take it back. But in this world, because it's become so conditioned that you have to make your money grow, that only exists because your money loses its value. And then people in the financial industry have made it really easy to take risk, that those lines became blurred between savings and risk taking, where people think about when they put their money in a mutual fund, whether it's a bond mutual fund or a stock mutual fund or an ETF, whatever it may be, some widely diversified instrument, that they think about that as savings, and they're not realizing that they just took risk to get money and to create some excess of the amount that they produce versus the amount that they've consumed. And then they take that and they put it back at risk. And so it's kind of what I started the piece, because I think it's something that again, you or I or most people, They probably never have seen it in writing or questioned why it is, but they know that phrase, make your money grow.
Yep.
And I start the piece out because I want to stop people and cause them to question that it's, do you actually need to make your money grow, or do you just need a better form of money? And while that's not a 100% one or the other type of equation, that once you have made money and made savings, if you have an idea to be able to go create value and solve a problem to make more money, that risk will inevitably happen regardless of the fact that money loses its value, but that the negative incentive and the negative feedback loop that is created by that exact condition of money loses value ultimately ends up in risk-taking, for risk-taking purpose in ways that wouldn't happen if not for kind of this existence in the world.
Yeah, I think you've answered this already, because I was gonna ask, you defined why people are incentivized to make their money grow. It's because it's almost become what everybody else does. And then my question was going to be, well, so why don't people just choose to, just keep some money in the bank? And that's where the disincentive element comes in, is that just keeping your money in the bank, you're falling behind, and there's nothing you can do about it unless you jump in line and get on the same rat race that everyone else is on. And like it just reminds me of like the carrot and the stick, right? So the carrot is all these 401ks and all these, mutual fund products and bullshit, and we're chasing that carrot. But the stick is actually the thing that's really structurally almost created the emergence of the carrot. Is that stick is monetary inflation, is this corrupt devaluation of wealth that naturally forces people to look for an alternative other than saving their money, which is supposedly, like you said, their money, what they have left, their savings, is supposed to be the difference between or it's supposed to be the surplus between what they produced and what they consumed. I personally, it's funny, once you've taken the orange pill of Bitcoin, you look at that in a different way. You're like, well, why should the product of my labor, the surplus of my labor, vanish or devalue over time? It just makes no fucking sense. But that's what happens. And people inherently are disincentivized from saving, and, end up getting stuck on this freight train of chasing yield, not because they want to, but because everybody else is, which I find wild.
So I think that keys in on kind of the precise point, which is, the point that you made, Bruce. Why would somebody, okay, if they recognize this, they just keep cash in their bank account. And the reality is that both scenarios are losing scenarios. You basically, when you eliminate door number 3, which is save and that actually being a positive outcome for you, you either live in a world where you perpetually take risk, that surplus that you do create, people plow it into stocks and bonds, and they think about it as savings, but it is inherently a risk-taking activity. So it puts you on a loop of constantly taking risks. Or you recognize that this is screwed up, and you're like, you know what? I'm gonna go against the grain, and I'm gonna knowingly hold cash in my bank account that I know is going to purchase less, because I know that this alternative of these people playing musical chairs over here is going to end really badly. And my scenario is bad too, because I'm on the melting ice cube. But I understand the distinction, and this alternative is better than the other. But it's not that, when you look at Bitcoin and people see the price of Bitcoin going up all the time, which, it's a lot of fun, NGU technology, it is a real thing. The simple fact is that in a world that's fully Bitcoinized, Bitcoin isn't going to be going up, 10% in a day or 15% in a day. It's going to be perfectly stable, and there's no express guarantee that when you make money today, that in a Bitcoinized world, that a week from now or 2 weeks from now that your money is going to be worth more. All that it does is ensure that the guaranteed outcome is not that your money is worth less, which is the environment that central banks create. So they basically create, and I refer to it as it's where damned if you do means damned if you don't in the central bank world. And that it's not so much that, I'm guaranteeing you that if you buy Bitcoin, your money's going to purchase more in the future. All it does is eliminate the express guarantee that your money is going to be worth less in the future. And when you correct that monetary incentive, it's this recognition that, like, imagine a world where there's 21 million Bitcoin. Because this is one of the things that central bankers are so concerned about, or that Keynesians are so concerned about. It's like, if you have a form of money that increases in value over time, people won't make these investments that they deem to be, quote, necessary. But if we live in a world where there's only 21 million Bitcoin, recognize that all future investment comes from some form of monetary savings. And so if we're living in that world where there's no more, no less than 21 million, it's not so much that risk won't be taken. It's more so that by creating the proper incentives to hold money and to save, it puts the control back in the person that holds that unit of currency as to when they take risk. And that the consequence of creating an environment where money is engineered to lose its value, it's like the central bank taking out a gun and putting it to the head of every single individual in a society and saying, invest it now rather than later, because if you don't do it now, it's going to purchase less in the future. Well, what type of outcome do you think that results in when everybody isn't taking risk out of free will, but they're doing it because of some manufactured incentive? I think.
Yeah, it reminds me of like doing things consciously and with intent, and what everyone's doing at the moment is like completely unconscious. Like and you just sort of like the example you used at the beginning with how you chose a 401k. It's like this blind product, that is made up of a bunch of shit you don't understand, and it's given a fancy name like growth or this or that or whatever, and it's just this complete unconscious process of doing it because other people are doing it. It reminds me of this social experiment I did when I was younger, like 2021. I did a bunch of NLP and hypnotherapy and all this sort of stuff. And me and a friend of mine, we used to play games in town. Like we'd go and knock on doors and we'd like use this linguistic script to ask somebody to just randomly give us money at the door. And most of the time we get chased off, but some people did it because we'd sort of use sort of language patterns to achieve stuff. But there was this one time where we thought, wonder if we can make a whole main street of people just run in a random direction just because everyone else is running. So we were sort of in the middle of this street. And
like, are you screaming or are you screaming or is this?
So we're like, run. And, I started running and then my friend started running and there was a couple of us and then and I think there was 4 or 5 of us, but we started running. Then some other people started running and the whole fucking street just started running. No one knew why. No one knew what was going on, but the whole street started running. And it was just this wild experience. And I mean, back then, like, I was a punk kid. Like I didn't know too much about, the stuff we discuss these days about, Austrian economics and incentives and stuff like that. But just that same, that herd mentality is, I think, in many ways, that the disincentive that exists is sort of the trigger that drives people towards taking unnecessary risk. The 2 doors that are available. So it moves them towards door number 2, but it's almost like it's that thing that everyone's doing, and we forgot why we were doing it in the beginning. So we all just do it anyway, and it's this same. Everyone's running down the street, not because there's any danger, but because someone else is fucking running down the street and we don't ask questions. It reminds me of which, as a topic, we probably, let's not diverge into this, but it reminds me of the mask stuff today, and the corona hysteria. It's like everyone's just doing it, not because it makes any sense, but because the idiot next to you is doing it.
Right. And I think that if we take that corollary or kind of think about the parallels between that to Bitcoin is kind of immediately everyone does it because there's unknown, right? And then as people start to observe what's actually happening, kind of remove themselves from the situation and just kind of observe and question certain underlying assumptions, then slowly people come back out to a more sane version of reality, where they can actually take a step back and observe and then make a more informed decision once they start to kind of have a different framework to think about things. And I think that's exactly what is happening in Bitcoin, which is everybody was on this race, where they're all running in the same direction and they just got thrown into that and they don't necessarily know why, but it's normal, so do it. And what Bitcoin does is it causes everyone to start questioning assumptions. And inherently, people don't do that all at once, but that slowly people look at this equation, and as soon as they start to understand Bitcoin, and really for the first time in most people's lives ever having to consciously consider that question about what is money, what causes it to hold value, what causes it to lose value, what makes something a better form of money, what makes something a worse form of money, that then becomes this, kind of pierces the veil to then start questioning the assumption around other things. And that it really does, in my view, sit at the foundation of the whole broken structure around this financialized economy. Again, with a caveat that it's not to say that we're going to go from a world where it's hyper financialized to zero, but to say that there's a lot of glut in there that exists, because if you just have a form of money that is structurally engineered to lose its value versus just the opposite of like creating uncertainty, say maybe it goes up in value, maybe it declines in value, that what that means is those two worlds are so diametrically opposed to each other, and one creates the ultimate negative incentive and the negative feedback loop, and the other creates the most positive reinforcing feedback loop, because it's just that control and where control lies. Does control, and is there a gun pointed to people's head that says, hey, this thing that you work so hard to get, well, you better do something with it now because it's going to lose value, versus living in that world that says, hey, if you've created value, which inherently means you've created value for somebody else, that now that power lies in you and you hold the key, that you're not going to turn the keys over until somebody provides value back to you. That creates a very positive feedback loop versus the negative feedback loop where you live in the world where the value that you've created for somebody today is going to purchase less from them in the future. You have less of an incentive to create value for others.
Dude, that's such an interesting point, actually. It's just given me an epiphany, which is this idea that, and I mean, we all know Bitcoin is this, I call it the renaissance of responsibility. So, it puts you back in the driver's seat for the first time in God knows how long, where you can actually consciously make a choice or choose a direction where to allocate your resources with some form of intent. It aligns so perfectly with what we opened up the discussion with, which is writing an article with a point or with an intent. I think these days, like, what we see with these 401ks and this sort of over financialized or overly financially engineered world we live in, there is no intent, there is no point. Like, it's this mad fucking race where nobody knows where they're running or in what direction they're running. They're just doing it because somebody else is doing it. There's no more point. It's much like the academia bullshit, which is I'm writing it because someone told me to put 10,000 words on a page. Doesn't matter what those 10,000 words are. It doesn't matter what the product is or why I'm investing or who I'm investing in or what a problem we're trying to solve. We're just throwing money in some direction because we don't know what else to do with it, which is such a wasteful act. And I mean, there's actually an avenue, which I don't know if you discussed this in the article, but I think it's probably a poignant area to dig into, is just this idea of if money is supposed to represent, like, capital or, the product of our labor, and that capital and the product of our labor is a mixture of, our capital, which is time and effort, but also natural resources, which is this finite stuff that we have. When we have a lot of waste in a system, it is directly it is a causal factor behind environmental degeneration, environmental destruction, like all the stuff that a lot of lefties and SJWs and all these sort of people complain about, like we're killing the earth, we're burning up all our resources. Like, I wouldn't even want to imagine how much, if you sort of related those resources that are being wasted in this over financialized world, how much of an impact that actually has on our finite natural resources, not to mention how much time, energy, and effort is wasted on every single human being's part, being driven into this pointless shit here that doesn't actually create anything or solve any problems or do anything. It's just chasing God knows what into the sunset. So I don't know if you got any comments on that as a ramification of this derangement syndrome.
I think that what it does is, or kind of, because I do think that those are the type of subjects that I think like these discussions naturally lead to, which is, but the further that you get away from that structural problem into more derivatives or derivatives on derivatives, it's harder to like create the direct link. So then there's plausible deniability, right? Like where we'd say there is a lot of consumption that happens in the world that, again, I'm not and I know this is not your personality either. Mine is like, I'm not, whoever wants to spend money on whatever they want to do, like that inherently isn't wasteful. It's in the eye of the beholder. But what happens is that when you have negative incentives in money, you have a misallocation of resource. You basically, the communication signals throughout an economy as to what preferences would be, if not for that monetary manipulation, are inherently different. If you manipulate the money supply, and that manipulated money supply is sending false price signals, or let's say it a different way, if you're deciding who to hand money out to in the case of the Fed, that you're now giving your money, you're basically inflating the money supply, but what you're actually doing is you're shifting the balance of who holds the currency, and you're weighting it, and advantaging one universe of people over others, and now those universe of people get to dictate what their preferences are under the rest of the people in the world. And that if you didn't have that operation, you would have essentially a more unobstructed or a less manipulated view of what humans actually prefer and what the preferences are in society. And you would also then naturally get to a place where you're most efficiently consuming resources, because that for people that have never thought about it before, and again, I don't say that in a pejorative way. I say this, anybody who realistically has probably come in and started to be interested in Bitcoin or own Bitcoin has had to face those questions for the first time. It's like, it's one of the best things about Bitcoin is that it's actually what spurs these questions that people have and these thought processes. But when we think about what money does, it just, kind of imagine a world where there's 21 million Bitcoin. All it's doing is going from me to you to the next person it's basically something that remains static and total, but it allows us to coordinate to make things out of the natural resources that exist in the world. And that it effectively allows humans to coordinate in a more effective and efficient way to communicate value. And we do that through an intermediary kind of good that we call money, or we all have come to call money. And in that world, it's just that if you and I all know that we're playing by the exact same set of rules, then we're naturally going to be able to communicate what we value more effectively. If you start to live in a manipulated form of a world where that money isn't kind of fixed in supply or dictated by some free market, then we suddenly live in a world where you and I have, the three of us, kind of, or you, me, and all the Bitcoiners have money, but then suddenly the Fed comes in and drops, increases the money supply by 50%. Well, whoever got that money, their preferences now get weighted disproportionately, right? And so it's just that, you think about, it's not that things won't be consumed or the same, or that people won't get to express their own preferences. It's just that in aggregate, we know that we're all consuming the resources in the ways that result in the least amount of waste. So I think that does kind of feed into this conversation. And it's that, the way that I tie it back to what I wrote on is that imagine a world where you know that your money is going to lose value. Your every single consumption decision and investment decision gets influenced by that fact. It becomes part of reality. And then imagine that world didn't exist and your money had some positive real yield, that its purchasing power increased. Then every single decision, just by crossing over that kind of key defining line of money losing value versus money not expressly losing value, every single economic decision that you have becomes sharper. And that the main point of my article was that kind of below the sea level line, or below kind of the point of zero, that causes this idea of, okay, suddenly I just can't save money and have that positive incentive be reinforced. I actually have to now go take risk. Whereas I'm not necessarily consuming, but I'm putting my capital back at risk just to recreate the value I already created. Like it just, every single economic decision, not just investment, it negatively impacts it. And that the end point, not the only point, but one of the end points is we live in this world where a billion people, or calling the billion people the developed world, is constantly trying to, they have this natural inclination to save, but they can't do it effectively just through their monetary medium. And they're forced into this wedge, which is taking structured financial risk and layers of financial risk. So I think it's one example of that waste. And it's ultimately the culmination of a misallocation of capital, and the fact that we can't communicate information clearly just directly between all the people that actually make up the real economy.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest outcomes or problems with that is that capital is no longer helping solve actual problems. It's actually chasing God knows what. Like I was on a podcast with Guy Swan, and we sort of spoke about this. And I've got this theory that the reason why banking, finance, and tech have sort of become where most of the brain power of the world is going. Like if you look at where most of the engineering openings are, you look at the two power centers of the world, it's San Francisco and New York. Arguably you can sort of throw London in there, maybe Shanghai and a couple of things like that. But effectively, these power centers have all become tech and finance, because that's the quickest way to potentially earn a return. So we're out there, instead of solving problems that I would argue that would be solved in a world where we're not just blindly chasing yield because there's all this excess capital being created and the incentive to just chase yield, is there. I think we would actually move towards solving meaningful problems, because fundamentally, what do entrepreneurs do? We solve problems, and the greater the problem we solve, the more opportunity we have to earn something from the capital we've put at risk, or the time or the energy we've put at risk. Whereas today, that's all been deranged. It's sort of like the world, to me, like if I was to caricature it, looks like that Brazilian bodybuilder who put that synthol in his biceps. He's got these big fucking biceps, but everything else is underdeveloped, right? So we've sort of overdeveloped in areas that there was no problems, but we're just sort of building shit on top of shit. And I think DeFi is a great example of this. It's a hammer looking for a fucking problem, right? And it's just
with the weakest of foundations.
Yeah. It's dumb on both angles. It's not needed, and it's built with something that's completely pointless to build it on. So it's dumb squared. Like it is it's a ridiculous idea. But I want to come back to just this idea of purchasing power, like in a world that is post hyper Bitcoinization, say. So when we've got you were talking before, imagine a world where we've got 21 million Bitcoin. Just so the listeners can sort of hear this argument articulated is why, how does purchasing power increase in a world that's hyper Bitcoinized? Can you explain that to us?
So if we just think about money as that fundamental tool that, and I talk about this in the piece, that, imagine 21 million Bitcoin existing. And then if the consequence of having a, I think I call it the paradox of a money with a fixed supply, that no more than 21 million Bitcoin can be saved. But the consequence of that statement is that all Bitcoin are always being saved. 21 million are always being saved by somebody, and that it's just transferring from person A to B to C, kind of in that perspective. And in that world where no more money can be saved in aggregate, it actually creates the incentive and the propensity for more individuals to save. And so when we think about that, it's like, okay, well, what is the actual role of money? There's only 21 million, and then it's just transferring between entities, transferring from me to you to me, from company A to company B. But it's that function within an economy of coordinating and marshaling all other resources, human time transmitting into natural resources to create something. To think about as like, one way that I often visualize it is a fixed line that's 21 million, and imagine a city growing up from dirt to New York City or Sydney or some big city. That it's money that allows for all the economic actors to coordinate and to take all those raw materials and turn what would be something that was physically in the ground to a skyscraper that's 100 stories. That requires human capital and requires a near infinite or practically hundreds of millions of people coordinating to make that happen. And it can't happen if not for money. And so in that world, there's 21 million. And as the city gets built up, we're just using this tool that isn't increasing in nominal supply, but we're using to coordinate to make things out of nothing, or to turn things that are natural resources in the world to things that then become functional for us. And those things that can become functional are, imagine you start with 21 million and then all of a sudden there's a pipeline that brings oil to your city. And now you have more oil, so you can buy oil. There's a water and waste management system that had to be built. Okay, now there's a water and waste management system. Oh, we need power that's delivered to the home every single day. Oh, we've got that now. Oh, we value this thing called telecom, so we're going to build a telecom network. All the same while there's just the same amount of money. So as we build new things, that nominal amount of money that remains fixed purchases more, but it only purchases more because it's the tool itself that is functional, that allows us to create all these things. And that, I think, where that kind of really ties in back to the piece is that finance and financial products, where they're valuable, is it essentially allows us to pool risk, to create projects that maybe one single person with a certain amount of capital can't create. And so there is this functional role to financial products and to some financialized world. But the thing that really matters is getting the pipeline built, the telecom network built, the water and waste management, the power system, the grocery store. Those are the things that are in the real economy that we actually value. Money just helps us coordinate to get those things. And certain, kind of financial structures allow us to maybe get a bridge built that wouldn't have gotten built if not for some pooled financing vehicle. That all contributes to adding real world value. The things that don't are when we then revert from kind of losing that North Star, or understanding that is the guidepost, and resulting in a world where we've become so detached from the things that we actually are being created at the end, where we're just taking risk for risk-taking purpose or to make money, where it becomes detached from that idea of actually creating value. Because I know you started off with that question of how does your purchasing power increase, which it is just that world of this thing, money, if it's functional, it results in us having more things. And we don't have more things if the money isn't coordinating kind of economic activity effectively.
Yeah. I think what you just mentioned just before reminds me of that famous Bruce Lee quote when he's pointing at the moon, and he was like, I'm going to paraphrase really badly here, but it was something to do with most people will focus on the finger and miss the moon. So it's like that's where we are now. Instead of like investment has become the process of investing in vehicles and financial instruments, no longer the allocation of capital towards the creation of the pipeline, the grocery store, any of that. Like we don't know where this money is going. It's just, we're investing in the financial vehicle that's supposed to facilitate the production of something, but we're not producing anything. We're just creating vehicle and then a derivative of that vehicle and then another derivative and then an aggregation of all these vehicles into some structured product that is then sold as an ETF or a mutual fund or something else. And it's like, we have no fucking idea what problem is being solved anymore, because it's just, a derivative upon a derivative upon a derivative upon a derivative. There's nothing there anymore. We're not building a bridge. We haven't solved the problem.
Yeah, and I think the other way that I think about that is there are things still, because I think this is something that people struggle with. There are things that are being created in the world today, right? So like we're still like building shit. The thing is that when you manipulate the monetary incentives, you build significantly different shit than if you had properly aligned incentives and the different people control the balance of power of how that capital is allocated. And that when we get back into a world of Bitcoin, and one of the articles, because I think this is really important for people to think about and recognize that on an individual level, it's like difference between risk and savings and what really risk is on an individual level. Because you did mention this before, which was, imagine a basketball player, devoting their time and energy through, high school, college, or university to professional sports, where like they spend every waking hour of the day crafting a skill, and then they put on a performance and somebody pays them for that. Or imagine that it's somebody that is a heart surgeon. They've gone to school for 10 years to learn how to, open up your chest and solve a problem for you. Or a builder. Somebody learned all the little, nuances of how to erect a home that you could now, use your money to spend. The risk taking is in those years of education of your time and energy in the build up to some output that somebody else finds valuable. That is what risk taking is on an individual basis. You're investing time and energy, often cumulatively over years, to have some skill set that somebody else in the world may value and that they'll pay you for. And then think about how idiotic or backwards it is that if you take that risk on the front end, that you now have the money. That's the end point of risk taking. Once you've gotten the money, somebody said, yes, you invested 10 years of your life and that resulted in a product that you delivered me today, and I gave you money for it, that world becomes massively backwards, where that risk taking is not the end of that endeavor. It's I now have to take it and put it in 75 different stocks because, for the mere fact that all that 10 years that led up to this point in time will now purchase less in the future. That it becomes a backwards incentive. And that I think one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin, and that, kind of one of the ways that I didn't key in on this, I mentioned it in the post, but it's that with a decentralized money supply and with a fixed money supply, by putting that control back in the hand of the individuals, the consequence is, rather than me taking the output of my labor and, ad infinitum and thoughtlessly dumping it into somebody else's financial product or business, I am now, it's like, I've got the gun, I'm in control of the Bitcoin key, and it only leaves my possession when somebody delivers value to me that I deem to be sufficiently, kind of worth my money and my output. That world results in this decentralization of the setting of preferences rather than a more controlled and centralized version which exists today. And that in that world, we're just going to, it's not that things aren't going to be produced. It's just that the people holding the guns that say, hey, build this to me, are going to be able to do it without actually a gun and with this thing money. And we're going to be able to say, hey, you're all operating on my rules. We're all going to be playing by the same rules. And the output of that is, we're not all going to be 401k investing in structured financial products. We're going to be investing more in ourselves. And you're going to have less big business, more small business, because you're going to decentralize the risk taking too, as a function of that.
Absolutely. I think one of the points there is the fact that all of our excess capital, instead of us being able to allocate it towards something that we consciously want to allocate it towards, or if we don't want to allocate it towards something, like if we don't want to, the fact that we can't just save it now means that there is all of this excess capital getting sent and basically feeding the behemoth that has now become the stock market, the bond market, and all of that shit, which is even further skewing how the system works. It's like we're actually creating the monopolies that government is supposedly against by being forced to have no choice but to send all of our money into something that we don't understand, that we don't really care about, instead of being able to save it for that point in time down the track when we actually want to allocate towards something that we give a shit about. It's so fucking wild. It's fundamentally distorting the very fabric of society. Like it's concentrating society into something that is more centralized, more concentrated, more fragile, and more prone to the dictates of a few, instead of the preferences of every single individual. And that, I think, is a sickness.
I couldn't agree more. And it's a sickness that most people have no concept of, right? And that's the worst part about it. It exists and they feel it. It's like a weight, bearing down on them, but they can't identify what the source of it is. And then they oftentimes point the finger at different things, not understanding the source. And so I kind of think about Bitcoin as it's a 2-in-1 solution. It is the vehicle that wakes you up to this false dilemma that's been manufactured. And then it also, in one package, creates the solution. So it helps you recognize a problem that you didn't know existed, but that you were suffering through. And then it also says, oh, and here, this is your ticket off the hamster wheel at the same time. And I think that just, it's a process that everyone will recognize. And the other kind of, where I key in on it is, think about, there's 17 trillion, or one of the charts that I have in the article, there's 17 trillion in negative yielding debt that exists in the world. And I have one chart where I talk about, I show the 10-year yields on like 15 different countries, and they range from like negative 50 basis points for Switzerland, and I think just under 1% for Korea. And people are going to start evaluating this and be like, if I start thinking about that idea of risk, of it's actually the lead up to the point that I get money, and then once I have money, like, do I take incremental risk from there, or do I save? If I just have a better form of money, does it make sense that I then give it to a government for a negative yield, or that I give it to a government for 10 years for a slightly positive yield? And that as people wake up to this reality, they're going to say, overwhelmingly, on an individual basis, they're going to say, that makes so much less sense than I can have my fixed share of the scarcest form of money that has ever existed. And it's going to cause people to enter into the Bitcoin economy, leave the legacy economy. But the consequence of that, and the kind of cycle that I draw out, is there's this world of, in total 270 trillion of debt. Not to say that, again, there will be debt in the future, but that is like the target, the target's on those people's back to say, as they evaluate each different form of that, and it's going to start with the most obvious, like the negative yielding sovereign debt, or the very paltry or 0.1% 2-year treasury, and then like the 1% US treasury, where they say, should I do that, or should I buy my share of 21 million? And I have this, I've been through this experience myself. It was part of the motivation of this. I converted all of an old IRA that I had from that dated back to ironically to my time at Deutsche Bank that predated the financial crisis, 2006 to 2009. And I converted it all to Bitcoin earlier this year. And the way that I describe it for people is that, because certain people that don't have the perspective that I do would think about that as a massive risk-taking endeavor. I view Bitcoin as not taking risk. It's savings. I'm not investing in a financial asset. I'm investing in a monetary asset. I felt the process, because what that was in previously was in 10-year treasuries effectively, or ETFs that held 10-year treasuries. It was in the financialized world. And as I looked at this, I said, I could either have this web of counterparty risk and currency risk and duration risk, or I could just convert it all into the scarcest form of money and hold the keys to the castle myself. Which one of those equations make more sense? And then when you're going through the process, through that process, I actually had to read a bank account, because you have to have a bank account, you have to create a new bank account for the trust that holds the IRA. And when you actually read a bank account, then it makes the whole concept of Bitcoin even more intuitive. But the amount of security that I felt since I just like the instance of converting it. And it's really that kind of, a critical piece of this is distinguishing between savings and risk taking, and recognizing that Bitcoin, yes, it may be volatile, but it is fundamentally not a risk taking endeavor. Now, and that those two things are very different, volatility and risk taking. And so I think, investing in financial assets, risk taking. Saving in Bitcoin, not risk taking. The more people that evaluate that equation, given the spectrum, and start to understand that, it puts people in a better decision to unblur those lines between risk taking and savings, and that more and more people will continually opt out, sell the financial asset, buy Bitcoin. That selling of the financial asset will inherently impair the legacy credit system, which will induce or accelerate the process of QE, which sets the wheel back off in terms of printing money, creating the demand for Bitcoin, or at least waking more and more people up to the value proposition of having a currency that has a fixed supply, which then sets this wave back off of selling financial assets to buy the new monetary asset. And it just kind of goes on until we end up in a world that's hyper, it's the flywheel of hyper Bitcoinization and DeFinancialization.
I think one of the beautiful things there that I want to pull on and make clear for the listeners is this idea of Bitcoin as a savings vehicle. And it's funny because, that sort of epiphany hit me a while back when I particularly when I was trying to form up, in the early days of building Amber, I was always, there was always pressure from investors, because we sort of started Amber up in the whole 2018 period. And, it was still very, hot on multiple currencies. And then, when I was like, look, we're not doing an ICO, we're not doing all that sort of stuff. Then the next bit of pressure was, oh, why don't you create, multiple currencies on your app so people can diversify? And I'm like, well, look, this is not an investment app. I don't want to build another, and I love the term shitcoin casino, because that's effectively what all of these applications are, whether it's DeFi, whether it's Binance, whether it's Coinbase, all these things are just effectively shitcoin casinos. They're a product of the existing financial system and the existing, over financialized mindset, which is people just fucking trading and gambling, really, gambling with their funds. And my whole raison d'etre, I guess, for Amber was, I want to create a savings product. I want to create a way, because I don't view Bitcoin much the same as what you said, is it is a risk off asset. It's not a risk on. It is, I have, it's the only place I can have a guarantee that I own it. It's not going to be inflated. It's not going to be taken away from me. I own a fixed piece of the pie. And, you know, my ability and your ability and every Bitcoin hodler's opportunity for an increased, like Bitcoin's price increase is not that we're all getting relatively richer amongst each other, is that the amount that our piece of the pie buys is increasing because the aggregate purchasing power of Bitcoin is rising. So we're not getting richer in Bitcoin terms. We're getting richer in, I guess, as a function of Bitcoin's purchasing power increasing because people are moving out of shit.
Yeah, and I think about that. It's really difficult because it's difficult to describe this process, but it's that the monetary network of Bitcoin is becoming more valuable as more people adopt it, and so our nominal units are increasing in value because more people value, and that it's kind of one way to think about that is 0.1 Bitcoin being worth $100 is less valuable than 0.1 Bitcoin being worth 1,000 versus 0.1 being worth 10,000. And it's only going up in that scale. And I'm only describing it in dollar terms because the dollar is still the unit of account. And it's the best way for us to think about real purchasing power, but that transition's happening to Bitcoin. That is only going up because more people are adopting it. More people are in the monetary network, and now I can go potentially trade with more people. That's what's fundamentally happening, is the world's converging on Bitcoin as the monetary standard. As more people do that, each person on average has a smaller and smaller unit of the currency, but the nominal amount isn't important. It's just a matter that can effectively coordinate and communicate value. And so I think like it's essentially that purchasing power is going up as the world is converging on that new monetary standard. But then as that happens, the monetary standard becomes actually more valuable. And so when I think about, because I do think, again, I think that the exchanges provide a very valuable service in terms of being able to be a liquidity center for Bitcoin. But if you're only doing that one service, and that you're effectively, your value is being monetized in trading shitcoins, that world doesn't exist in a hyper Bitcoinized world. And I think you can't come to that view if you don't also come to this idea that you only really need one currency. Certain people look at it and be like, oh, how sad is it going to be if after all this there's just one currency? It's like, no, that's the whole point. That we don't need, think about your daily life when you go around. I'm in Texas, you're in Europe or wherever you may be now, but you go around, you only interact with one currency. Yes, multiple currencies exist in the world, but on a day-to-day basis, 99.9% of people, they only interact with one currency. And it's not just by coincidence. It's because of the function of money, that it's solving this intersubjective problem of how we can communicate with each other. So it's like, no, you guys are all swimming upstream. And I think this is how you think about Amber. It's how we think about Unchained. It's how do we create value for people in the Bitcoin world? And the way I think about that is, we're a piece of infrastructure, you're a piece of infrastructure at Amber, and we need to figure out how to solve problems for Bitcoiners because everyone's going to have Bitcoin in the future. And that means less of a financialized world and more, how are these people going to secure their money and how are they going to move it around in the future? And that's the value proposition. And that there's this other idea that I key on in the piece just at the end, but it's that the beautiful, because I don't think about ourselves as a bank. We provide a financial service, but in the case of our custody, we're basically preserving the permissionless property of Bitcoin. And I think that there's room for kind of all ranges of custody and non-custodial and people that just want to be on an island by themselves. But that the beautiful thing about Bitcoin is that it allows, imagine that we weren't both, in 10 years, people aren't going to be working on Bitcoin companies, it's just going to be money. But that in the current iteration of the economy, everything flows through the banking system. The banking system has this monopoly on the monetary capital of how it's created and that it can be created based on subjective rules. And then every financial transaction effectively has to flow through there. So the banking system sits in the current economy, in the current financial system. The banking system sits at the epicenter. It's like the banking system has become, by manipulation, the heart of the economy. Everything, if that system fails, it's like a choke point on the rest of the economy. Now, realistically, and that's what guides central bankers. That's why they have to bail everybody out. They fear that if the banking system went away, that the real economy would go away too, and it would impair the real economy. But there'd still be pipelines in the ground. There'd still be factories. The coordination of that would have to be rehabbed. But what Bitcoin basically does is it takes out that center choke point of the banking system. That, imagine the world where the guy who built the pipeline can pay the guy who built the power plant directly in money, or that the guy who created the power plant can pay the telecom provider directly. They're like, that doesn't have to go through the banking system. And that if we're thinking about creating value in the world for Bitcoiners, it's basically helping to build that monetary infrastructure. Because one of the ways I describe Bitcoin is, it's like, imagine when gold was emerging as a monetary standard. At one point, gold was ore in the ground, and that a monetary system had to be built around it. And that gold became more valuable as the infrastructure got built, as people converted it into coinage, built better ways to secure it, built settlement networks. Bitcoin is that ore in the ground. And you and I and other people that are working around Bitcoin are building the infrastructure to make it more valuable. And as the infrastructure gets better, it opens up the doors to more people to adopt it. And then as more people adopt it, it becomes more functional, and its purchasing power increases. It's all that kind of very positive reinforcing, flywheel. And it's just, and also there's a reality that as people look at this equation and they stare at it and they look at it, it's 21 million. They gain some semblance of an appreciation for how that can exist in the world. They sell the financial asset and they buy Bitcoin, and they actually take energy out of that legacy system and imbue it on the new system. And it's a dynamic world in that way, where that Bitcoin gains mind share, and that as it gains mind share, it actually increases in value because it becomes more functional. But it gains that mind share and it increases that value in competition with the legacy system, where it's taking energy from.
Yeah, I can't help but imagine the whole Bitcoin as a black hole, or as a center of gravity when you're describing that. It's literally, and this is sort of the beauty of systems thinking and I think Bitcoiners are just naturally systems thinkers, is we realize that you can't solve one thing in isolation. And I think part of what is going to make Bitcoin so successful is all of the excess crap we've sort of created. Now Bitcoin is going to suck all of that excess capital and all of that excess financialization. It's going to then compress it into something that is got no waste. Like you said, the pipeline operator can pay the energy operator. So things can happen directly. We don't need all of this middleman intermediary waste that has to exist today by virtue of the fact that we can't trust our money. We don't have any objective standard or network that we can all sort of tap into and operate as a part of. Like, we require all of these intermediaries upon intermediaries upon intermediaries for this thing to function. So I love this idea that during this discovery phase of Bitcoin, and I always kind of explain Bitcoin as buying it today is like discovering gold when everyone was still using shells. And imagine having this big chunk of yellow rock 5,000 years ago. People would have laughed at you, and you couldn't have bought anything. But if you were able to live 5,000 years, that big chunk of yellow rock could have bought you a kingdom. So it's sort of the same thing, with Bitcoin now during this discovery process. But then to come back to our purchasing power thing in a hyper Bitcoinized world, I just wanted to clarify that, an economy is always a closed system. It's a complete system, and all that happens is, new people are born, we create new things, we create, more productive ways of producing stuff or inventing things in more innovative ways. And what we're doing is we're increasing the productive capacity of the system that we're all a part of. So, the purchasing power, when I look at it in a hyper Bitcoinized world, is Bitcoin's purchasing power either increases and it can potentially decrease if the collective productivity of the society within which we're in, if we all turned into fucking zombies and retards, guess what? Bitcoin's, purchasing power would also decrease, if we, blow ourselves up in the process, right? But if we make the assumption that when people are making good decisions or are incentivized to make appropriate investments or take risks that are properly accounted for, and productivity increases, then the amount that you hold should also increase in lockstep with that. And that's sort of the that creates this beautiful situation where, as society gets better, the money gets stronger, and then that further makes you think twice about where you're going to allocate or where you're going to risk the capital that you have. And that doesn't eventuate into some scenario where the fucking whole world stops spending money. It actually leads us to better decision making.
Yeah, I think that is one point that I made in this piece, which is
100%.
There's this Keynesian worldview, which it is so lazy, which is if money is increasing in value, people will never, spend it, and we won't have things or whatever. And it's so insane because it's like, hey, Bitcoin's up 20% today and people are selling it. I don't know who those people are, but money is increasing in value, and every single day people are selling it. And then the price of Bitcoin goes down and people are selling it. I don't know who those people are at, but it doesn't matter. It's like money is a tool, and its whole existence is at coordinating economic activity and being an exchange intermediary good. And that picture the world with 7 billion people. This is how I simplified the article. 7 billion people in the world, and there's only 21 million Bitcoin. And those 7 billion people in the world all have to consume real things in the real world every single day. And the purpose of money is to coordinate that exchange. Money will be spent every single day. You don't have to lose sleep over it. Keynesians, like, we're going to be okay. And that really, to your point, it's if you picture that flat line of Bitcoin of 21 million as a flat line unchanging. It's like if there's more things being created, the purchasing power of money goes up. If there's more, if things are basically becoming rendered obsolete, like say we go into a depression and the plant, it goes, it stops working, and then the people that have the skills to stop running the plant, like that is capital coming offline. That there could be a world where for certain periods of time there's the same amount of money and there's less productive capacity. But it's not just, even though I'm using this analogy of a city being built, it's also, think about the human capital of arts, music, somebody investing their time in human capital, that it's not all just materiality in the world, that it's the person that learns how to play violin, and that if a person has the proper monetary incentives to save and they have a money that's working in their favor rather than against them, maybe they become a violinist rather than a stockbroker. And that amount of human capital is not all physical in the world, but that it leads to kind of an amount of decision making and kind of, I think about it as like decentralized. It's just, it aligns every incentive within an economy, decentralizes the risk taking, but it then puts the proper incentive in place that culture can flourish because of the consequence of what that money means, which is simply that, and it comes back to this core piece that we talked about earlier, which is in a world where money isn't manipulated, where, envision that world where there's a fixed money supply. The only way for you to get money is if you deliver value to somebody else. Now, you could be a criminal and play with negative incentives, but 99% that if you live in that world, you get money by delivering value to somebody else. In the current world, you either get value by delivering, or you get money by delivering value to somebody else, or because the Fed prints it and gives it to you. And it just so happens that in that world, 80% of the dollars that have exist have been created by the Fed in the last 10 years. So you can live in a world where you're not actually delivering value to people and still getting money. In this other world, which is Bitcoin, the world we're heading towards, where you have a fixed money supply, that purchasing power, because again, it's not just I'm going to go buy a bigger house. It's that now maybe my purchasing power set is there's this amazing violinist that's going to do a show tonight, and I can go watch that. And that didn't exist because the person didn't have the proper incentive to invest 10 years to do that, because they got put on the hamster wheel at the age of 18 and ended up in a wrong place, you know? And again, I view it as, I don't know what that future world looks like. It's impossible to predict. I don't know if it's a violinist or a celloist, or maybe it's not anybody and we decide we don't like violinists and cellos, but that it's, if you just take the fly out of the ointment, which is a money that is engineered to lose its value, that we're going to be able to get back to a more harmonized world where preferences are being set by the people that actually make up an economy, and they can more directly communicate with each other, that will naturally lead to better outcomes than a world where 100% of people are being not, and I don't want to say like there's not like a person pulling strings like a puppet, but that realistically we're all manipulated by false price signals that are being created by manipulated monetary incentives. Whether that's whether that, you know, you argue that's good or bad, that's just the reality of what's happened, you know, in a very emotionless way.
I think, you know, what you're saying there just resonates with me so strong, because I have an argument, and I did this in, I don't know if it was the piece for Bitcoin Times or if it was another thing, but I said that all human rights boil down to a single human right, and that is the right to choose. I think, you know, all other human rights fall into two categories. One, they're either a derivative of the right to choose, which is, you know, the individual is the closest person who can make a determination, or who can make a determination for their own human action. Like, I'm the closest to my own decisions. And then every other human right is just this bullshit made up crap, which is somebody else's responsibility, you know, which is not really a right. It's actually an imposition on somebody else's right to choose. Because, you know, if one person's right is another person's responsibility, then the person with responsibility has no right. So I think what Bitcoin does is it brings the ability to choose effectively, intelligently, and consciously back to the individual. Because now you can choose what you want to do, as opposed to, like you said, it's not necessarily some, you know, Bilderberg lizard person pulling the fucking strings. It's effectively an incorrect incentive that then takes choice out of our hands, and the choice of, you know, things like money creation and capital allocation, all that sort of stuff is completely outsourced to a small group of people who, depending on what side of the bed they woke up on, decide to print, you know, 2 platinum fucking coins worth 2 trillion this year. Why not? You know, why don't why not 10?
Right.
Why not 20 trillion? That'll solve all the problems, right?
That is, I think that's completely, you know, that is exactly how I think about it, which is oftentimes people say Bitcoin's too complicated, whatever, you know, not people aren't going to understand this. When they start to they don't have to understand how Bitcoin works, but when they start to understand that these two equations exist and that these two worlds exist, that when they look at that reality and they're able to observe them too and be conscious of those two choices, everyone overwhelmingly chooses, you know, door number 2, which is Bitcoin in this context, because they realize that each one of that incentive aligns with each individual, and that when you add up a world where the incentives align for each individual, you get an aggregate incentive that aligns for the whole. Again, without having to have some, you know, kind of centralized coordination. It's just that, like, if this form of money aligns with my incentives and it aligns with every other individual actor in this economy's incentives, then when you add that all up, we're going to get very positive outcomes. I don't know exactly what that world looks like, but the aggregate outcome is going to be, far greater, putting the control back in the individual's hands that actually make up the economy, rather than, to your point, which I think is the right framing of it, then a small group of people that can arbitrarily change how the pie is constructed. Because I think about it as, when the Fed decides to put $3 trillion into the economy, they have fundamentally altered that economy. It will never be the same. It alters preference. It puts money in the hands of people, right or wrong, that now have more power to dictate the preferences of what then gets built, because money coordinates it. And all this does, it takes the fly out of the ointment and says, hey, this is the amount of money, and whoever has the money has delivered value previously, and then they determine who is delivering the most value going into the future in terms of what their actual needs and wants are. And that in that unmanipulated world, everybody, not to a person, but in aggregate and in an overwhelming fashion, ends up in a far greater position than the former.
It's yeah, there was something I wanted to mention about that. Yeah, actually, the note that you just said then is like this group of central bankers who can just arbitrarily change the rules, and they effectively, are taking choices away from the individual that they would have normally made in a rational sense. So we sort of, you hear people talk about, humans are irrational. I actually think that humans are rather rational, but we're forced to make irrational choices in a world that's becoming more and more deranged. It's like, do I run in that direction or that direction or that direction? I don't have the time to figure out why I'm actually running, but I just see people running in every fucking direction. So I'm making what seems to be irrational choices, but the only set of choices I have are an irrational set, because decisions being made at the center.
Yeah, and one of the points that I make in the article is that if you make doing dumb shit more rational, people will do dumb shit. And it's this idea that, like, if we go back to that idea of, really, there should be, there's two doors, and both doors are losing doors, which is either put your money back at risk, or you have to, just hold money that loses its value into perpetuity. That people, by taking risk in that world, it's making that risk taking more rational, because their money is losing value. They're being forced to do dumb shit because they're rationally assessing the range of outcomes. And it would be, and this is exactly to the point, if that false dilemma didn't exist, they would do less dumb shit. They would rationally say, you know what? I was being rational before and taking all this financial risk to an extent, maybe not, 100%, but on the margin, I was more correct in making this decision because I was doing it under the knowledge, not just the assumption, but that the knowledge that my money loses its value. What happens when I take that out of the equation? Mm-hmm. Now I sit there and say, okay, well, I no longer have to operate in that reality that my money expressly loses its value. Maybe I shouldn't take that, financial risk. The need now doesn't exist. And the point of kind of the DeFinancialization is, now we're about to go on a price discovery route, or, just an endeavor where we figure out just how much of the risk-taking appetite and endeavor was induced by central bankers printing money, versus people taking that risk on their own free will, because no one truly knows how much of it is one versus the other. But that's what we're going to find out. We won't be able to expressly quantify it, but we will know directionally.
The tide is going to recede, and we're really going to see who the fuck is swimming naked, man. Like,
I love that Buffett quote. I think Buffett is he's one of the crony capitalists, and he just doesn't understand Bitcoin. But that idea of, you find out who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. That's exactly what we're going to see with Bitcoin.
100%. I want to pull on one more thread here, or maybe two more threads. I actually want to mention, I'll write a note here to talk about Dalio and hedge fund managers and shit, and why I have a disdain for them. But before I do that, I think one of the things here that we just discussed is this idea that Bitcoin sort of brings the locus of choice back to the individual. And that is, that's the fringe where the best choices are actually made, as opposed to centralizing choice or centralizing decision making and the ramifications that has on then imposing that onto everyone. Is why I've always argued that Bitcoin is diametrically opposed to anything anything crypto, anything DeFi, all of that stuff. To me, is just more is incarnations of more fragile versions of fiat. Like when I look at crypto, when I look at DeFi, when I look at Ethereum, when I look at all that fucking garbage, all I see is fiat upon fiat upon fiat, built on shaky infrastructure with derivatives, and programs that are in themselves broken, but that can precipitate catastrophic. It's like the dumbest of the dumb. Like I actually think crypto is even dumber in general than the normal financial world, because there's absolutely no checks and balances. There's no nothing, and it's just this completely fragile edifice of nonsense that has come about as a function of the fiat financialization that we live in. And there's two parts here that I want to pull on. Is one, just the existence of crypto just being a private variation of central banking. It's, we're talking about Bitcoin bringing the choice back to the individual and moving it away from a cabal of central bankers. And these idiots in crypto never got the memo. So they're like, central bankers are bad, but crypto is good. So we're going to roll our own currency. And between 5 or 6 of us, we're going to decide how much should be printed. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, that has nothing to do with Bitcoin. So it's like, that's number one. And then number two is they take it a step further by making themselves look even stupider by saying, all right, not only are we going to do what the central bankers are doing anyway, but just, with our own set of rules on a digital network that we, band-aided and fucking, duct taped together. But now we're going to build a world of decentralized finance on top of this steaming pile of shit. And that's apparently a good idea.
There's a quote that I love from, I don't know if you ever seen the movie called Bull Durham. It's like an 80s American movie.
No.
And there's a quote where he says, you couldn't hit water if you fell out of a fucking boat. That's how I think about, the DeFi crypto world, which I think Jimmy wrote an article. This was probably back around the Fork Wars a while back. So Jimmy Song, another contributor to the Bitcoin Times, a friend of mine here in Austin, and he talked about how Bitcoin Cash was fiat, and it, when you think about that, oftentimes we talk about how Bitcoin only has there's only ever going to be 21 million, and what I really anchor people to that point, but then I say Bitcoin doesn't really only have 21 million. It's just a monetary policy driven by consensus. That if the consensus, it's like Bitcoin is monetary policy by consensus, central bank is or fiat is monetary policy by central bank. And that in this world, Bitcoin's permissionless, anybody can opt in. And if an overwhelming majority of people decided that we should have some other bell and whistle in Bitcoin, or that maybe there should be 22 million, if the overwhelming consensus decided to do that, that would be the consensus, and that would be Bitcoin. There just so happens that an overwhelming majority that opt into a fixed supply currency regime for the express purpose that it has a fixed supply won't overwhelmingly decide to change that rule. That keys in on the idea that if you go build your own altcoin, that you weren't okay with the consensus rules of Bitcoin, and that you wanted to create by fiat your own rules to the system. And so it's like that world already exists, and it exists in a way that you can never create that value, which is it's the dollar system, or it's the euro system, or it's the yen. So you're just creating a worse form of fiat, but it's lumped in with everything else. It's monetary policy by fiat versus monetary policy by consensus. And that in those worlds, like whether it's DeFi or the next, it's the utility token, whatever the next iterations, the stable coin, it's everything is built off the same foundation and it's inherently weaker. So they get you confused where they're talking about, decentralized, lending and like all this shit, programming the machines, and it's going to be beautiful. And it's like, I point at the foundation. I'm like, yeah, but the foundation is fucked. Yep. that whole thing down there, that everything else that this is built on, it doesn't have a purpose because Bitcoin exists. And that overwhelmingly, I think the beautiful thing is that with all this noise, there's 1,000 cryptocurrencies, and there's, shitcoin casinos, and there's 1,000 different of these things, and each altcoin trader has their favorite one. The market still sorts through that noise and converges on Bitcoin because of something so kind of simple as 21 million. They're there are so many affinity scams and snake oil salesmen in this space, but that price of Bitcoin going through its all-time high means that Bitcoin is so powerful of a tool and so strong of a signal and such a large value proposition that all this shit can be thrown up against the wall about why something doesn't make sense or how something else is better. But overwhelmingly, the market converges anyways, out of necessity.
Yeah. Man, I think I've called it economic Darwinism in the past, but while you're saying that, it sort of dawned on me. It's like the fact that Bitcoin can continue to succeed in the environment that we live in right now, which is like a completely overly financially engineered world of noise and waste and central planning and fucking madness. The fact that Bitcoin, is still able to pierce through that crap now in its nascent infant form, man, when Bitcoin's in its teenage form, and moving into adulthood, there is no force that exists that could, reverse it. So it's like,
right. And it becomes a snowball effect, right? Because I went on the Max Kaiser show and I talked about this. It was a lot easier. It's a lot easier to make that decision when 100 million people have Bitcoin than it was when it was 1 million, right? Sorting through that noise, and so it just, the determination becomes easier as a function of time and people having gone before you, and where it becomes like the fact that we've gotten to this point, it's like the next 5 years or 10 years, there's always going to be something, so it's not to say it's going to be easy, and ain't nothing easy, but that it becomes easier and easier, and that causes this trend to accelerate inevitably.
100%, man. Look, is there any other points in the article that I mentioned that I wanted to talk about Dahlia? So I don't know what your position is on him. I know, Breedlove, who's a good friend of both of ours, I guess, he wrote that long piece. I actually wrote a piece called Correcting Dahlia, I think about a year ago, or maybe it wasn't even that long ago now, where, I don't know, I've that guy's always rubbed me the wrong way. And I've, reading your piece when I was compiling this whole Bitcoin Times, it just sort of reinforced that underlying notion. I think you just articulated it so well. There's this underlying notion that a lot of Bitcoiners sense is that, this whole, hedge fund, mutual fund, fund of fucking fund, infrastructure that we have, all these vehicles that have sucked up all this capital, they're not actually, not only are they not adding value or doing anything, but arguably not very fucking smart. They actually haven't created or contributed or done anything intelligent other than being really close to the monetary spigot, and had first dibs or second dibs on the capital that just got created. And the rest of us, by necessity, because of the dumb choices that we get, and with dumb choices people do dumb things, we've given all of our money to them. It's not that they were intelligent, but that they were effectively just to use a Nassim Talebism, like fools of randomness. So what's sort of your take on, these, hedge fund managers? Like, and I'm sure there's a series of them that are quite intelligent. But I get this sense that the Dahlias of the world are not actually that bright. It's, that they're beneficiaries of the paradigm that we're in more than anything else.
Yeah, I think we align on this one. I think that there's a reality that one way to think about it is, and I think I put Warren Buffett in this category as well.
Yeah.
They figured out how the game was played,
mm-hmm.
and then they played that game really well. So in that sense, they were smart in not necessarily understanding how real value is created or real economic systems work, but they saw the pattern, and they saw that was the reality, and then they played that game extremely well. And then their whole life was devoted to learning how to play that game. Well, when all of a sudden the rules to the entire game change, you shouldn't expect that the guy who learned and spent 40 years, that their entire reality and their entire kingdom was built on these manipulated economic incentives, for them to be able to see this alter reality, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that, and I had this quote. I'm going to read it because I had it in another article, and it was 2017, I think, and I'd been before I kind of. It might have been just after I left working for the hedge fund. I do think that like 97% of these people shouldn't be working for hedge funds. Maybe 3% of them are actually good at what they do, but they exist because of this financialized world, and they'll all go to be doing something else in the world. Kind of after we hyper Bitcoinize, or through that process, help be part of it. But I was sitting there watching Dalio on CNBC. This was before I cut my cable, so I don't have cable anymore. But Dalio on CNBC, and he's describing QE, and this is talking about, I think that they're signaling that they're going to unwind QE. There's money and there's credit. The only thing that matters is spending, and you can spend money and you can spend credit. And when credit goes down, you better put money into the system so you can have the same level of spending. That's what they did through the financial system. He's referencing QE in response to the 2008 crisis. And that thing worked. And when I listened to that, I literally took out my iPhone and I recorded it. I was like, this is insane. Like, how can somebody, like, this guy has no concept of what actually happens. Like, he sees the symptoms of these problems. So he's like, he sees that there's something fucked up, but like, then he makes comments like that, like, there's money and there's credit, and the only thing that matters is spending. And if you don't have enough, if credit goes down, then you better put money in the system. You're like, wait, what? You're the most revered hedge fund manager of the last 2 decades. Like, how can this guy be the standard bearer? And I positioned that quote with, now this isn't a real quote, but I was like, that's like conventional wisdom in the financial world. Like, that's how people think. They say 2 things. They say QE is crazy, but the Fed had to do it. And there's no logical connection between those 2 thoughts, but that's what the 99% of the hedge fund world would say. To, hey, the Fed printed $3 trillion. They'd say, that's crazy, it's going to end badly, but they had to do it. And you're like, well, explain to me that thought process. Because the common sense person comes to a different conclusion. No, they didn't have to do it, and they actually created a worse problem by that mere fact. We just have a longer, lower time preference. And so I kind of, in my post, this was one from maybe June or May. It was called Bitcoin is Common Sense. And so it's like, that's like the defending the existing custom, what Dalio did. And then my basic, kind of basic Bitcoin common sense is a picture of, Jeffrey Lebowski from The Big Lebowski, where someone's like, hey, there will only be 21 million Bitcoin. And somebody just with, average intelligence will look at it and be like, that's fucking interesting, man. That's fucking interesting. Where it's like, it's just a very simple equation. If you tell somebody there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, that it doesn't require what our kind of legacy society would dictate as a high amount of intelligence for just to use common sense and be like, yeah, that whole thing, $3 trillion being printed by the Fed in, between March and June, not only does it not make sense, I want out. I want off that train. Like this thing over here, 21 million, you're telling me that's it? That's the whole fucking shebang, shebang? Yep, that's it. Boom, I'm in. So I think that that more and more people's eyes are going to be open to this. And I recently saw something, it's like this whole kind of idea of macro. And again, I worked for a guy in Dallas at the hedge fund that I was at before I left to join the Bitcoin world, Kyle Bass, like somebody who I have an immense amount of respect for. So I don't think it doesn't apply to everyone. So it's not, I'm not describing everybody in this sense, but that 97% or somewhere around, again, it's not a precise number. I haven't done, a statistical analysis, but it's somewhere around that range, 97 out of every 100, has this problem. And it's just a function of living in that system for a long time and being the boiling frog. And that in this world of macro, I put a quote out where like Luke Gromen said something that was entirely idiotic. Like the US should just increase the value of its gold holdings as priced in dollars. And it's like, I put a tweet out that was, this is your brain on macro. Just
I remember that one.
Just increase the value of gold. Like that somehow solves all of our problems. And one of the ways that I described I was like, in this piece I wrote before, it's think about the operation of printing money. Even if it's now digitally created by the Fed, just think about the exact moment that money is printed. Did any other value get created in the world? Zero. And that all of this is to be said, that there is value in capital allocation functions. There is value in pooled investment vehicles, whether it be stocks or bonds, and projects that dictate some financialized structure to be able to pool risk. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that this kind of risk-taking has been massively inflated and caused by misaligned and broken monetary incentives. And those two things are entirely different. And that the more that this world, I feel like it's a freight train, steers towards Bitcoin, more and more people just open it up to this reality. And they're like, hey, yeah, that thing that macro guy said doesn't make any sense. Like he doesn't actually understand it. It becomes a signal. And then more and more people just kind of, again, it's impossible to predict what causes somebody's eyes to open up to this, kind of truer form of reality. And it just happens on, everyone's individual timelines. And it does become easier over time, though, because not just is there more infrastructure and more content, but that there's also more people that have gone before it. So the consensus is more obvious.
Yeah, dude, I think the word that comes to mind, as you were describing, the Dalio comment and everything is like, and the complexity that they like to sort of wrap all these things in is sophistry. It's like we live in a world of intellectual sophistry. We're just talking in circles, and this actually reminds me very much of Vitalik. Like in the early days when I first started getting into the space, like I revered Vitalik. I thought it was really smart, but the more I dug into it, like the more I realized, like, this fucking idiot doesn't actually say anything. He's just talking, and then dumber people just assume. And this is another one of those functions of, people just running in a direction without knowing why they're running. It's just because everyone else did. Is like, people like a Vitalik or a Dalio and all that sort of stuff end up being revered in this world because they give these sort of eloquent, fancy explanations and things that, when reality is a lot simpler when you remove all of the glut, and reality is like, no, 21 million is the concept and this fixes it, and it's like done. And they just sort of, they look at you like you're an idiot, but in reality it's like, yes, it is that simple. It doesn't have to be complexified. Like, and it's almost, it's the same cancer that permeates academia and the intelligentsia. It's like they want to create complexity and all this excess crap to almost validate their existence when you can just remove all of it and come to
It's
something.
one way that because I do think that it's a symptom, and it's a symptom of this distorted world that we've lived in,
Yeah,
where it's like you're trying to solve all these problems, like the window dressing on the 100th floor of a building, and the bottom 10 stories are Jenga blocks.
yeah,
Where it's like
yeah,
you're insistent on talking at this level way up here, and I'm like, no, the base, the foundation is fucked, and that
yeah,
we can't even begin to have these conversations about the derivative consequences until that's fixed, and that you do start to it like becomes a Bitcoin is the best kind of signal for bullshit, like,
yeah,
and it
yeah,
allows you to just be like, wait, now, like, okay, I don't know if I have time to refute all of that bullshit, but I have immediately determined that there's a flawed assumption, and I can not necessarily discount everything else that somebody says, but it just allows me to more effectively allocate my own time, where it's like, no, like to what you just said, and I think it's very aligned with how I think about it. It's like, oh no, it's this simple. Like, people think about Bitcoin as complex. It's like, oh, I don't have to take all this risk, or like this is so complex. So like, after my day job, I got to become an expert stock picker or expert investor.
yeah,
I can just focus on what it is that I'm good at and how I can create value, and where I have a quote an edge, not in terms of a financial investing standpoint, but in terms of an expertise, a craft, how you deliver value to others. And one of the comments that I made at the end is that there's something cathartic about finally saving in a form of money that has aligned incentives and works in your favor rather than against it. And that the consequences, you actually, on days like when the price of Bitcoin's up, 20%, 24,000, of course, I'm going to be like, I solved this morning and it was, fun, and, got some text messages, and we love number go up. But on a day-to-day basis, because I have Bitcoin and because it's working in my favor, I'm actually focused less on making money, and I am focused more on just executing and working for Unchained and creating value through that. And then multiply that by 1 billion people or 7 billion people, where they're thinking actually the consequence of having a form of money that works in your favor is that you then obsess over money less. It's like
it has the
might
opposite effect.
may sound counterintuitive, but that when you have that money that works in your favor, you actually need less of it. And when you actually need less of it, then you can focus on the getting back to the basics and things that actually matter to you. And those things that matter actually vary between every person, and it's not prescriptive, but it just affords you more time to not worry about this thing, money, and it basically removes this problem that you didn't even know existed in your life.
Yeah. I think I'll wrap this up with one anecdote that I think will really relate to people, and it was one of the reasons why I really, really, really loved your article. Is this whole idea of definancialization, hit home for me about, I think it was a year and a half or 2 years ago, when I was sitting in a cafe with my mum, and she's a hard worker. She's not like, she's a good woman, she's not like, overly intelligent. She's sort of like a, more like a, she I can't remember where she works. I think she works as like as a clerk or an administrator or something like that. But she's a good woman, and she's a very good saver, right? So she works hard and she puts savings away. And I remember sitting in this cafe, and she was asking me, she's like, I've saved up all this money now. And she's like, what do I do with it? And she's like, your brother, like my brother's one of those classic, like, I think my brother's a fucking monkey, and he's like a classic macro type guy, like looking at the quad fours and this and that and trying to make decisions about where he should allocate money. And he's constantly chasing himself, fucking making money, losing money, making money, losing money, making money, losing money. And, he's got this dream to become a fucking hedge fund guy. And he runs a small fund, but it's just like he's just consistently, ever since I've known him, he's just chasing his tail. And Sorry about that. There was a bit of noise in the background. But, my mum's sitting there like almost in tears asking me, what do I do? She's like, I've saved all this money. She goes, I'm not getting anything in the bank. Your brother's asking me to invest in it. I'm like, fucking don't give it to him. She's like, should I put in this fund? And it's like, I felt so fucking bad for her, man. I'm sitting there thinking, holy shit, here's this woman who's spent, 30 years or 40 years of her fucking life, like working in this country, and she doesn't know where to put her money. And I was like, man, there's something fucking sick and deranged about this society when somebody's too scared to hold their savings somewhere, something that they've worked their entire fucking lives for and don't know where to put it. And like, I think your piece just articulated that so well. And I have to say, it's like probably my favorite piece in the whole Bitcoin Times. It's just like it's such an injustice to everyday humans that they don't have a fucking choice to just set it aside and use it later. They have to do something with it. And
it's like it guarantees a negative outcome, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And I think that that world it's like it's a weight that's bearing down on everybody's shoulders, and they don't understand the source of it. Like they know, most people know that money loses value. Fewer people know that money loses value because the government prints it. But they also just accept that as a reality. And then there's a lot of other bad, negative kind of consequences or feedback loops that happen from that cause stress and whether it's emotional distress or just stress about what happens if maybe it's your mom and she's like, hey, I've got this much money, but if I'm going to live for another 40 years, that and I'm not getting a return on this, it's not going to pay for everything. Mm-hmm. That causes and dictates behavior that otherwise wouldn't happen. And that when we get back to this world where again, I think about in my own world, and it's to your brother's point, or to your description of your brother, it's like trading is a non-productive activity. There is like when you think about it, it's like trading is zero sum. Now, if I can own money and then I can build infrastructure at Unchained, my money is a good form of money, so it's going to hold its value. It's Bitcoin. And I can actually deliver value through the infrastructure that I'm building on Unchained. I can get more money. That's how the whole thing works. And everyone does that, whether it's the violinist or the celloist or the guy, the wildcatter that's going and drilling oil wells. If everyone just has a better form of money, they can figure out whatever that range of thing is that they want. It's like basically harmonizing between what they enjoy doing and what others value. And if you have a good form of money, you get good outcomes in that harmonization process. If you've got a bad form of money, you still have, for a period of time, things being built, but you cause over time that societal fabric and the whole system to fracture until the point where it no longer works, and then you get Venezuela. And
Indeed. And it feels like we're all going to fucking Venezuela.
That way. And Bitcoin is really that thing that brings us back from the brink, in my mind. That's why I'm so optimistic about the future.
Yeah, man. Look, one final thing I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned Kyle Bass. So when I was younger and I was sort of involved in markets and all that sort of stuff, my two favorite guys were actually Kyle Bass and Hugh Hendry. I know Hugh Hendry sort of like went off the deep end. I think he kind of like closed down his fund and all that sort of stuff. But what's Kyle's position on Bitcoin? Like, are you still in touch with him, or?
Yeah, I stay in touch with him, fairly regularly. If we don't talk on a weekly basis, we talk on a monthly basis. But I think that there was a period of time where he got really excited about Bitcoin, and then I think he developed a view that Bitcoin's success would be its failure, that it would be like he understood the value of that 21 million fixed supply and why that had a place in the world, but that the Fed and the Treasury would just take everybody out to the woodshed and shoot the Bitcoiners. And so I wrote an article that was Bitcoin can't be banned, and I didn't ever expressly tell him this, and it was more for like people in general, but I wrote Bitcoin can't be banned for him. Like
Yeah,
basically, he developed this view that was like, kind of for the regulatory consequences of it. And I wrote an article that said, hey, even if you think that that's a reality, you should still own Bitcoin. So I think he's coming around to it for sure. If he, I don't actually, ask him specifically whether he owns it, but I think, if it's not now, it's a 6-month equation.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because I've always believed that Kyle's a really really sharp guy. I actually had the pleasure of talking to him in 2011 or 2012. I was at this seminar that Tony Robbins had put together, and he had a bunch of people, and he brought Kyle Bass in. I think it was over a conference call or something, and I sort of had a chat with him. So that was sort of it's interesting to hear that you actually worked with him, because I've always considered him one of the sharper guys, and I don't know. I think he's probably got a little bit too caught up in the whole what was it, the JGBs, like the crap that was going on in Japan and China and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's interesting to see how I think sometimes an overly high intellect can sometimes deter you away from Bitcoin in some senses, or maybe it's like a overly specialized intelligence versus a more holistic intelligence. What I find
what I would say there is Bitcoin is not an IQ test. It's a common sense test, right?
Yeah,
it's like
yeah.
If you're too laser focused of the way that the mechanics of the old system worked, and then you try to take that framework over and look at Bitcoin, you're like, no, this doesn't work. Like this is how the whole thing works. That then becomes harder to step away and be able to see the field for what it is, and to have that perspective, to be observant rather than if you're in the middle of the legacy system and that's all you can see, you can't step back and see it for what it actually is.
Yeah, it's classic forest for the trees.
It can be a hindrance.
Yeah, cool, man. Well, look, I'm gonna, unless there's anything else you wanted to mention here, but I think this has been a really, really good discussion. I think I think there's a lot of gems in here for people to realize that the whole Bitcoin gravity, Bitcoin black hole idea, and how it's actually going to definancialize the world is one of the biggest ramifications that it's going to have. And I know, like, Dieter Bob, who's one of the plebs, he always talks about, like, I'm in Bitcoin to blow up the credit markets. And for me, like, this is Bitcoin's moneyness and, common sense economics and simplicity is going to be, the cornerstone of its ability to, like, it is the zeitgeist that stands in contrast to, the fragile edifice that we live in. And I think your piece really articulates that better than just about anything I've read, in that context. So, I don't know if you've got anything to add, some final thoughts, maybe a plug for Unchained or anything, but dude, I really appreciate you taking the time for this and for contributing to Bitcoin Timers.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd just leave the audience with is just that idea that whenever I write something, it's not, it's how I look at the world. So it's, if people have different perspectives, I'm putting my kind of framework out there so that people can just kind of have an insight into the way that my mind works or how I think about Bitcoin. But that I think that if people look at Bitcoin closely and start to ask these questions about money and what is savings versus what is risk, that, because I don't ask people just to trust me. Like, just because I say Bitcoin is not taking risk and it's the non-risk asset, and that more people will save, and that will not being a risk-taking activity, and that fewer people will invest in financial assets, which is expressly a risk-taking activity. It's that, as you start to think about this framework, that you will kind of come to that conclusion. You will think about Bitcoin differently, as it is just designed to be a better form of money. It's hard to see how that see the volatility that then results in saying, how can that not be taking risk? Of course I'm taking risk, but that's not fundamentally the operation that's happening when people or it's not how I think about Bitcoin. But then also, when you think about Bitcoin as a tool and what it is at a fundamental level as a better form of money, that it truly is not taking risks. It's the risk off position. It's I'm going to hold a better form of money so that I can focus more of my time in doing the things that actually create value in the real world. And so it's just kind of, I think that is, I hope that it's thought provocative for people where they think about people. And I got, kind of the cue that it's time to go. But just if you spend time thinking about that thought process, you will, I think, increasingly come to the same conclusions. And that, I just want to thank you for, one, asking me to write on it. I was going to be writing anyways, but being able to have something that was focused and specifically for the Bitcoin Times, I felt honored to be included. I think it's hugely valuable that, in terms of the resource that you created in it. And then I also, just want to thank the other contributors, Jeff, Jimmy, Giacomo, Eric, and I'm leaving off, you, Alex. So,
yeah, man. Absolutely. Look, I really, 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 really appreciate that, man. So, where can people find you really quickly? So that way, anyone who hasn't followed you can follow you.
Find me at Unchained. So I lead our business development efforts here at Unchained. So if you need help figuring out better ways to secure your Bitcoin or need financial services, need a loan, need help buying Bitcoin if you're in the States, give us a call. And then also you can find me on Twitter at Parker A. Lewis. And then also my, obviously this version of Graduate and Suddenly is in the Bitcoin Times, but you can also find all of my readings on our website, on our blog under the Graduate and Suddenly series.
Cool, man. All right, buddy. Well, look, right. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, we'll definitely chat soon, bro. Thank you.